Okay, so last week we spoke about what happens what happens if you have cold contact between meat and milk. So, and that had all the ramifications about using knives and forks and plates and cups and things that you find in a non-kosher place when you're traveling, especially if you're staying in a hotel room or you're in an Airbnb or something like that, and the things are assumed to have been used with treif, but there are many heterim for travelers. You're in a situation of need, and therefore we can be lenient in a number of different halachas. And just to recap on the fact that we said that you can, that for things, for plates and knives and forks and things that were only ever used with cold, nothing was absorbed in them. All you have to do is make sure that they're clean, and you can use them. By the way, there's one little caveat over here, is that this heter applies particularly to kalim that are owned by a goy. If you have kalim that are owned by a Jew and the Jew hasn't put them in the mikveh, then you have a different problem. It's not a kashrus problem, it's a mikveh problem. And that is that you're not allowed to use kalim owned by a Jew unless they've been, if they need to go to mikveh, then they must go to mikveh. So that's a little concern. So just going a little bit into a tangent off, it's not exactly a kashrus issue, but it's in the same sort of playing field as all of our regular kashrus issues. So if, as is often the case, you have non-frum relatives who want to host you, and they're prepared to bend over backwards to make sure that you're comfortable eating with them. What kalim can they use, etc. So the kashrus is one issue. And the other thing is their silverware. For example, silverware needs to go to mikveh. If their silverware hasn't been to mikveh, they can kasher it all they like, but you still won't be allowed to use it. So it has to go to mikveh as well. And depending on, obviously, on the circumstances, you'll have to finesse it and talk nicely, and so maybe it's just better to use plastic or something, or whatever. Each individual situation you'll want to deal with on its specific merits. But just another thing that's a useful heter to know is that the things that really need mikveh are metalware and glassware. Metalware min haTorah, glassware midrabanan. Okay. Ceramics, there's ceramics is a discussion, because the ceramics are made of earthenware, but they're glazed. Okay, so now the glaze is, it is basically glass, but it's not the main part of the dish. So I will give you a useful heter to rely on if you there is, and the halacha. I don't toivel any of my ceramic stuff. I don't. It's even though it is glazed. My Rosh Shiva Zatzal, Rabbi Goldfein, held there was no need to toivel it. Rabbi Haber also said there's no need to toivel ceramics, which is also the opinion of Rav Scheinberg, because anything that Rav Haber says is whatever Rav Scheinberg said. So he's a Talmud Muvhak, and he tells over his Rebbe well. So that's just for in case you need to go somewhere and you're concerned about whether a Jew's kalim have been toveled. All you need to worry about is the silverware and the glassware.
Isn't there a question, Shaul, on whether to make the bracha on the glass or the silverware?
Well, if you've got I don't think you may. I'm not sure if you make a bracha on the glassware. Now you're catching me over here. If you only have glass, do you make a bracha on it? I don't know. If you have glass and metalware, then definitely make the bracha on the metalware.
Right.
Because that's a chiyuv d'oraisa. Yes, Lester.
Do the metalwork.
Talk about metalware, and then you talk about cutlery. What about pots and pans? Is that
okay? So now the pots and pans. Yes, if they are, that's also metal. That's definitely also metal. The pots and pans have the additional concern that they'll also need to be kashered for sure, because that's a kli rishon. It's definitely been cooking. I was just thinking in terms of the fact that your cutlery is never a kli rishon almost. I mean, maybe the spoons. Maybe if somebody sticks a spoon into the soup on the stove, then that spoon would be a kli rishon. The knives and forks, like almost never. But yeah, if you want to be safe with it, it would probably be a good idea to kasher them. It's not difficult to kasher these things, just by the way. All you need to do is make a big pot of water, to bring it to the boil, and when it's bubbling, you drop the cutlery in piece by piece, and it's kashered. That's it. As long as it hasn't been used in 24 hours, and it wouldn't have been. It almost certainly wouldn't have been used with as a kli rishon in the past 24 hours anyway, so it's very difficult to find a problematic case there. The pots themselves can be a little bit more complicated to kasher, unless you have a bigger pot that you can dip a smaller pot into to kasher in the same sort of way. By the way, kashering, kashering is different from mikveh in a couple of respects. Now that we're on the subject, if you want to take a pot to mikveh, you have to submerge the entire thing at one time. You can't hold, let's say you've got two handles. You can't hold one handle and dip it in, and then take the other handle and dip it in and keep the other side out. Mikveh requires the entire thing to be submerged at once. Okay, kashering is not like that. Kashering just means you have to get to every part. So if you can only dip, let's say you've got a big pot of boiling water and you've got a smaller pot that you want to kasher inside there, you can do it half and half. You can kasher the first half, pull it out, take out of the hold of the other side, dip in the other side, because there's a mechanical process going where you're getting the taste of Isser out of the pot, and that can be done piecemeal.
Of course, if the pot or the glassware or whatever it's cutlery is made by a Jewish company,
if it's Jewish manufacturer, that doesn't need mikveh.
Doesn't need mikveh at all.
Yes.
Okay.
That's actually quite an important little point there. Is that you don't need, is that something that was completed by a Jew no longer requires mikveh. That, by the way, that's an interesting possibility, that if you find it difficult to find somewhere to tovel a pot, if you can get in with some tools and dismantle the pot, like take apart the handle, screw it off, get it to a point where it's no longer really usable as a pot anymore, and then put it back together. That could possibly make it Jewish manufacture, but that's only really if it's a Maaseh Uman, if it requires a certain amount of skill. But if any like 5-year-old could pick up a screwdriver, take out a screw, put a screw back in, that's not really considered manufacture. That's just it's not called a Maaseh Uman. It would I think I may be wrong here, but my first guess would be I would be looking for something that would be prohibited on Chol HaMoed, right? Maaseh Uman, right? If you can't do it on Chol HaMoed, then that's something that you could that would constitute making the pot.
Of course, as far as that mikveh goes, if with bracha, if you have a question about whether it's glass or needs it or doesn't need it, if you do the silverware first, make the bracha, then you put the glass in afterwards, then you're covered in both cases.
No, definitely. You make the bracha on the metal, and then you do the metal, and then you do the glass covered by the same bracha. Correct. Right. I mean, look, it's not a shaila. If you have glass only, you still have to tovel it, but you just might need to tovel it on the bracha. And I'm afraid I don't know offhand. It's something that's really basic, and I should know that offhand, but I'll have to get back to you on that. Okay. Just some more. Anything else that we wanted to say? Okay, are you allowed to drink water? Are you allowed to drink water from a glass in a non-Jewish home or a restaurant? What do you say?
Yes.
Absolutely yes. Yeah. Okay, that's just straight chazara on what we've done. All right, I just wanted to give the chazara on last week's shir. Now we can move on to this week. Okay. Up until now, we have been talking about the cases of cold and cold. Okay, that's where you put kosher, cold kosher food onto a cold treif plate or something like that. Okay, now we're going to start heating things up a little bit. What happens if you've got two hot things that touch each other? Hot meat falls into hot milk. What's the din? You're shaking your head, Lester. You're in trouble, right?
Feed it to the dog.
No, you can't feed it to the dog.
Ah.
You can't even feed it to the dog.
You can't benefit from it.
That's right, Donna. You cannot benefit from it. Okay, once you have basa b'chalav, once you have genuine, honest to goodness d'oraisa basa b'chalav, you are not allowed to have any benefit from it. If it was chicken, you can benefit from it because it's an issa d'rabanan. If it was meat and it got cooked in milk, finished. Doesn't okay. Now what happens if only one of them is hot? And that's what tonight's share is about. There's actually enough material on this for an entire share. And
So
what we will,
the meat is hot and the milk is cold?
well, it's not the question of whether it's the hot meat or hot milk. It's a question of which one is on top. Okay. And this has right. So this has some interesting thoughts in it. And let's take a look inside the Shulchan Aruch. So we're in Siman Tzadi Aleph, Tzadi Aleph Sif Daled. So it says the Shulchan Aruch, hot meat and milk that are mixed together. Okay, if you got both hot, even if cold meat fell into hot milk, now that is cold and hot. So if cold meat fell into hot milk, or cold milk fell onto hot meat, everything is asur because of the law of Tata'ah gavar. Now that's a term that you're going to have to take note of. Tata'ah gavar, it's Aramaic, which means the bottom wins, or bottoms up. So whichever one, so the bottom is the winner, and we'll go into the reason for that in just a minute. Okay. However, in the case that the hot milk fell onto cold meat, or hot meat fell into cold milk, then a klipa, that's the width of a peel, should be removed from the meat, and the rest of it is mutar. Okay, that's the Shulchan Aruch. The remark.
That again, please.
Okay. So if in the case of hot, cold meat falling into hot milk, or cold milk falling into hot meat, everything's asur. This is assuming we don't have a bittul b'shishim. All of that. If it is bittul b'shishim, then there's not much to talk about. Yeah. Okay. But if the hot is on the bottom, everything is asur. If, however, the hot is on the top and the cold is on the bottom, so hot meat fell into cold milk, or hot milk fell onto cold meat, then only a klipa. A klipa is the thickness of a peel of a fingernail. You need to scrape off the surface of the meat, and then everything is motar. The Ramah comments, now if the meat is asur kedei klipa, so now you had this meat, this hot meat fell into cold milk. So now the surface of the meat has to be scraped off. But what happened was, oops, they didn't realize that was the halacha, and they took this meat, and now it got cooked. So now they took this meat and put it into a cholent. The Ramah says, b'diavad, it's mutar. There's no isur over here. Okay, so these are some interesting points over here, and we're going to have to get into some debate about it as we go along. So the principle of Tata'ah gavar, meaning again the bottom is stronger. Okay, so whatever's on the bottom will either cook or cool the top, depending on whether it's hot or cold. If it's hot, then it'll cook the top, and if it's cold, then it'll cool whatever was on the top. So if the top is hot and the bottom is cold, then before the bottom can cool the top, nonetheless, some measure of absorption is going to happen, because at least there is some heat on the surface, and that is going to cause some level of absorption, which we say is thickness of a klipa, a very, very thin amount. It's not a not thick at all. You basically like imagine if it was a carrot, you could just use a carrot peeler and take off a layer.
Onion, like an onion, skin of an onion.
The skin of an onion, same sort of thickness, yeah. Although I mean, depends which skin. If you're talking about the flaky stuff that cracks off, that's probably not enough of a clipper. We're talking about the thickness of a fingernail.
Right.
Okay. So the source of this comes from Gemara Pesachim, where there's a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. Now, for those who've learned Gemara, you know that we have a principle of who the halacha is like when there's a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. Have you heard this mnemonic before? Aseh lecha Rav, knei lecha chaver. Have you heard this before? Okay, so Rav and Shmuel are two of the early Amoraim. In fact, Rav is actually accounted to be a Tana. So he's considered as connected to the previous generation, where he's allowed to disagree with a Mishnah, for example. He's allowed to disagree with a Mishnah or a Baraisa because Rav, they say, is a Tana or Paleg. So he's right on the cusp of the change in generations. And Shmuel is his chaver, is his friend that they were both Rosh Yeshiva. One was in Babylon, one was the Rosh Yeshiva of Surah, the other was the Rosh Yeshiva of Pumbedisa. And when there's a disagreement between the two of them, we have a rule which is basically you can remember by the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, which says, "Aseh lecha Rav, knei lecha chaver." Make yourself a Rav and acquire for yourself a friend. Okay, aseh. So aseh, when it's a mitzvah, aseh mitzvah lo taseh. In other words, isur v'heter, things like where something is asur or mutar. So aseh lecha Rav. So when it's dealing with matters of aseh lo taseh, we paskin halacha like Rav. Knei lecha chaver, when it's talking about kosher mishpat, when it's talking about civil laws between people, and there's a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel, knei lecha chaver, then we paskin like his chaver, who is Shmuel. So you can remember that in general if you want to know who the halacha is like between Rav and Shmuel. It depends on which subject we're talking about. However, in this particular case, this is one of the rarities where we actually paskin like Shmuel, because Rav says that. So there's an argument. Everyone, it's in the Gemara. It says hot into hot, everyone agrees is asur. Cold into cold, everyone agrees is mutar. Hot into cold or cold into hot, Rav says ila gavar, which means that the top is stronger, and Shmuel says Tata'ah gavar, and Shmuel says that the bottom is stronger. And the Gemara brings various proofs for the fact that we paskin the halacha like Shmuel, even though it's normally the area where we paskin like Rav. So it's one of our rare exceptions. Okay. So nonetheless, even though we say that Tata'ah gavar, if the bottom is cold, we still say since it has to do a little bit of cooling off from the hot thing that fell in, there's a clipper that became asur as it fell in before it cooled down. So that is okay. Now there are exceptions to the rule. Okay, according to Chavas Das, whatever piece is being leaned on is called the Tata'ah, which means that his explanation of why is it that the bottom is called stronger is because it's the piece that's stationary, that's kavua, and whatever else is coming is moving. So something that's moving in physics, something that's moving has got higher momentum, and so it normally wins in the equation. However, when it comes to halacha, we say the kavua is the thing that wins. Actually, now I think about it, just offhand, we saw this in a few places in Mishnah as well. We saw that when you have a tumah that's kavua, makes other things tameh. When you have a tumah mahaleches, when the tumah is moving. So, for example, you've got a weasel that's holding a piece of tameh meat or a dead sheretz or something, and it runs over all these loaves of truma. you don't have to presume that the truma became tameh, because it's a truma mahaleches, it's moving. So the movement actually reduces its sphere of influence, and that's an interesting, that could be an interesting sort of direction to take in a general analysis of halacha. The fact that actually the momentum reduces its effectivity in halacha, whereas in physics your momentum actually makes it more significant. So the Chavas Das is saying that whatever piece is being leaned on is called the Tata'ah, which means that also if the top piece was being held and it only touches the bottom pieces, but it never rests on it, there's no din of Tata'ah gavar. So even if the bottom is hot, only a klippa is asur. So if you're holding a cold piece on top and a splash. So let's say you've got a cold piece of meat and there's some milk boiling underneath it and a splash comes upwards. It's then according to the Chavas Das's thing, the meat is the one that's kavua, and the milk is, even though the milk is physically underneath, the splash is considered the moving bit, and therefore the Tata'ah gavar means that the meat on top would actually win, and you would only have to take off a klippa from the meat. Whereas if the meat fell down into the milk, the whole thing would become asur. Okay. Also, the point is here that whatever's in its fixed place is called the Tata'ah, as I mentioned. So in the case of let's say you've got a pot of cold milk and a piece of hot meat, and that falls into the pot. Now, obviously, the meat is going to displace the milk and sink to the bottom. Now, we don't suddenly say that now the meat is now at the bottom and the milk is on the top, so therefore now it all becomes asur. It's still the meat had to come through and fall through the milk. So whichever started out in the bottom is the one that wins. And in this case, again, your milk was cold, so therefore you would only have to remove a klippa from the meat. Okay, are we doing all right? Okay. Good. Now the Aruch HaShulchan points out that there's another exception over here, and that is that what about the relative sizes of the things? Because it's all very well to say that, okay, so the milk is whatever's on, let's say you've got your milk on the bottom, cold milk on the bottom, and a big and a hot piece of meat falls into it. That's fine as long as the things are relatively the same size. But what happens if you've got a huge piece of hot meat falling into a little puddle of cold milk? Okay, doesn't size or volume make a difference over here? So the Aruch HaShulchan says Chazal never discussed the size of the two objects, and therefore he concludes that that Chazal must have been talking about only in a case where there are similar sizes, relatively speaking. Okay, so it's obvious that it says it's just as far as stands to reason that if you've got a big chunk of hot meat falling into a small puddle of cold milk, you can't just say, okay, the milk is going to win, because there's too much meat there, and the Tata'ah gavar only applies when they're relatively similar sizes. And in answer to your question, where do you draw the line? Rav Hanan said that 5 to 6 times is considered within range. Once it's more than about 6 times the volume of the lower one, then it doesn't matter if the lower one is cold. The heat is going to win out. Anything else around here? Darchei Tshuva says that said we should only use this principle as a chumrah. So if the case is reversed, and you've got a small amount of very hot milk, and a big piece of cold meat falling into the small amount of hot milk, you still need to go. Now, according to this, we should say that, okay, the cold is much more than the hot, and therefore we should the cold should win, and it should only have to take off a klippa. But the Darchet Shuvah says no. We should use this as a chumrah only. If the bottom is hot, we still say Tata'ah gavar, and it's going to answer that whole piece of meat, assuming that it's between 6 and 60 times the amount of meat on the top. If it's more than 60 times, then you're not going to answer the whole thing because it would be batel. So if you're in that range between 6 and 60, then you're going to have a problem either way. Okay, so just to summarize that, the law of Tata'ah gavar still applies if the bottom is hot, even though the top is cold and many times greater than the bottom. That's the case I just brought now. But if the top is hot and many times greater than the bottom, then we don't say Tata'ah gavar. We say the top is big and hot, and it's also going to cause issues. Remember, we're dealing here with potential d'oraisa, so we do have to be particularly careful about this. Okay, now what about the klippa? So this is in the situation where we found that the bottom was cold and the top was hot. So now we have an isser of kedei klippa. Okay, and the mechaber says the milk is completely mutar. Okay, so now this is an interesting thing. We're saying that the meat you got to take off a klippa, but the milk is fine. This should make you scratch your head and say, wait, why is the milk fine? Isn't there a klippa somewhere in the milk that's is some part of the milk that's become aser as well? So a couple questions to ask. First question is, why does the Ramah say that if the meat was cooked without removing the klippa, that it's mutar? Remember, we saw that in the Ramah. He said that if accidentally you took this meat and stuck it in the cholent, so, oh, you shouldn't have done that, but now that you've done it, okay, it's mutar. If this is isser over here, this is a little line of basa b'chalav over here surrounding the meat. Okay, shouldn't you need to say this needs to be bottled b'shishim if you want to do this? You're going to have to say, okay, that klippa is not an infinitesimal size. It has, let's say, it's a millimeter thick. So now you have to calculate, like, what is the volume of the aser piece. So I mean, if the entire thing fell and was submerged in the milk, you have to start doing some advanced geometry to work out if the piece of meat is if the kosher piece inside is more than 60 times the klippa on the outside, because otherwise surely this should all be aser. And okay, so granted, if you got a nice big piece of roast or whatever, and then a millimeter is not going to make a difference. But let's say it was a hot dog. If you got a hot dog over there, that's that's the klippa can be actually quite a significant part of that hot dog. So now surely the Ramah should have made a comment about that. Second question is, what about the mechaber? Why does he say the milk is mutar? Don't you need 60 against the klippa of milk that became aser? Same question, basically. So whatever the surface area is of the meat that touched the milk, so now you've got to take, so however much of the meat became aser, whatever that volume is, the same amount of milk should have become aser. So surely we need to do get out our calculators and work out, is there 60 in the milk against whatever part became aser? So the question it's the same question, just in different directions. One is on the meat, one is on the milk. Okay, so in order to answer these questions, we have to take a look at the source of the din of the klippa. Okay, which is actually a machlokes between two rishonim, one called the riva and one called the ri. Okay, so Ri and Rabbeinu Tam are two of our Tosfos that you find in the Gemara. Okay, they say that the fact that a klippa is, he says that the fact that a klippa is aser is a chumrah. It's not ikar din. We just make a chumrah because it's hot, and we want to make people be alert to the fact that hot is different from cold, and therefore we aser the klippa just mishum chumrah, and therefore if it's just a chumrah, then we don't need shishim, we just need a batel barov. Batel barov is fine. Okay, and there was because Chachamim didn't extend the gezerah to 60 times. Okay, the Riva disagrees. The Riva says yes, you actually do need 60 against the klippa. It's a real isser, It's a real isser that's gone in whatever it is, let's say a millimeter deep all around the surface of the meat, and therefore you do need 60 because it's, and in the case of a and in the case of a liquid, you do need 60 against it because it's going to be distributed all through. In the case of a solid, the clipper doesn't spread unless it's cooked afterwards, so it's easy enough to remove. So it looks like the Mechaber and the Ramah have passed in like Rabbeinu Tam and the Rida, like the Tosfos, where we said that it's just a chumrah and it seems to be batal barov. That's their halacha. The Taz disagrees. The Taz is an Achron who paskins who's got a column on the same daf as the Shulchan Aruch, and he says it's he holds like the Riva. You really do need 60 against it. Okay, so the Taz is arguing on the Ramah. He says you do need 60. Okay, the Shach makes a difference. He makes a chiluk between the two. Why? Because where the meat was cooked without removing the issa klippa, and the case with the klippa being mixed in the milk, he says that there's a fundamental difference between the meat case and the milk case. Okay, so the Shach says there's a difference between what's called nikar and eno nikar. If it's something that's distinct, noticeable, and you know where it is, okay, that's a significant thing. So he says if the meat was cooked without removing the klippa, then you do need 60 against the klippa, like the Taz. So he agrees with the Taz on this point. He says this is because the klippa is nekar. It's recognizable. There's an entire, you could paint the outside of the meat red or whatever and say this part is isser. I'm looking at it right now. This is isser. And therefore I have to take it off. And if you don't take it off, you do have to do a calculation of, and it got cooked again, you have to do a calculation of 60. Is there more than 60 against the isser? Okay. But in the case of the cold milk, okay, so that milk let's say a klippa of that milk became asur, but where is it? You're looking at the milk and you can't see it. It's all mixed in, and there's no way of identifying any isser inside there. So according to the Shach, anything that's asur kedei klippa and gets mixed up, the term is nivlal. It's mixed into something else. It's batal, even though it was nikar at one time. At the moment that it fell in, you could take a snapshot in time and say, this milk here that's in contact with the meat at this moment, yeah, I can see it, but 1 second later, it's mixed up. You have no idea where it is. Okay, so he says that. So he says that in the case, he tries not to argue on the Ramah, and he wants to sort of retrofit the Ramah into his opinion. So he says that where the Ramah said that if it got cooked later, then it's still okay. It's talking about where the meat was broken up in a way that the klippa can no longer be removed, and therefore the 60 is not necessary. So let's say the meat got blended. Okay, so if the meat got blended and then got cooked into something else, then he would say, okay, it's nivlal. You don't need to worry about it. Okay, and in general, by the way, when we have a machlokes Shach and Taz, I think we generally do paskin like the Shach. So that's a worthwhile distinction to bear in mind, is why we will makbid on the meat and making sure that the meat gets scraped off, and the meat, it says the Shach, needs 60 against it, but the milk you don't have to worry about it because it's disappeared. Wherever that klippa was, it's gone, and we don't have to worry about the bittul b'shishim anymore.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What happens if the milk is not liquid milk, but something like cheese or
Okay, very good. Okay. I'm going to turn that question on you. What would you say? First of all, let's state the case clearly. Is the cheese on the bottom?
Let's say you've got a sandwich with hot pastrami at the bottom and cold cheese on top.
Okay, so cold cheese went onto hot pastrami. What's the din?
The hot pastrami underneath is rules.
Tata'ah gavar. It wins. Everything is asur. Okay, let's do it the other way. The cold cheese is on the bottom. The hot pastrami falls on top of it. What's your din?
It gets complicated.
Okay, Tata'ah gavar. The cold wins, but there's an isser of kedei klippa. Now, the problem that you brought with pastrami is that pastrami is already sliced pretty thin. I don't know what you're going to be able to do with it. But okay, but wherever it came into contact with the cheese has to be scraped off. If you can't scrape it off because it's too thin already, okay, too bad, it's gone.
You have that cheeseburger, and the cheese is on the bottom, and it's right now it's cool. It's not hot. You have the meat on the top.
Right, but so hot meat went onto it.
Right.
So if you had let's say you had a burger, okay, so the burger is a little bit thicker. You can work with that, and you didn't realize that somebody else was putting cheese on the roll, and you flipped the burger and landed it on the roll and said, "Oh my gosh, there's cheese on this!" And now that burger looks so good, you just got to have it. So then you got to take that burger off and scrape off where it came into you've got to scrape off a millimeter, let's say, where it came into contact with the cheese. And the cheese. Now the cheese is now a solid, as opposed to the milk, which was a liquid. The cheese is now a solid, so you're going to have the same thing with the cheese. So if you had a block of cheese that's thick enough that you could scrape off a layer, so you would have to scrape off a layer where the meat came into contact with it.
That's like your friend at the barbecue.
Right. If it had been the other way around again, where the hot meat was on the bottom and the cheese went on top, bam, all gone, finished. Okay. Anything else over here?
But all this is good. All this is meat if it's chicken. Right?
If it's okay, so look, if it's chicken, then you're talking about an Issa D'Rabbanan. It's still Asur. Okay, and you would have the same. You're going to have the same halacha of Tata'ah gavar. If it's hot chicken falls into cold milk, you're still going to have to take off a clipper. If hot milk, if cold chicken falls into hot milk, it's all going to be Asur, because D'Rabbanan, we also we don't like to be over in D'Rabbanans either, as my friend and colleague Nadav Rees likes to say. Says, okay, so instead of being bitten by a Doraisa snake, you'll be bitten by a D'Rabbanan snake. You don't want to be bitten by the snake. Okay. Right. So the various paskim talk about whether who to paskin halacha like, and in general, if you don't need to paskin lekula, then it's we're talking about basa b'chalav. You should only be makel in a hefsid meruba, says the Chachmas Adam. And so between all these paskim, if it ever happens, you'll want to see, like, okay, how big of a deal is this? Do I really need to rely on a kula over here, or is this something that I can just say, okay, I can be machmir on this. It's not worth that much to me. Okay. Right, and that's actually great timing, because we've just finished all the material that I wanted to go over for this year. Let me ask you a couple of interesting questions over here. If we pour hot soup from a kli rishon directly onto a plate, does that make the plate absorb the hot food? So we're talking all the time now about food onto food. What about food onto a kli? This has got many ramifications. It could be that the kli has become fleishik. Let's say you put a meat soup into it, so it comes directly from a kli rishon, so it's hot. Okay, and now it's coming into a kli sheni, but it came as an iroi kli rishon. So I'm glad that you were alert to that this is a kli sheni. That's very good. Okay. The only thing is that I've just introduced something now, sort of backhandedly, which is called iroi kli rishon, which is something that is poured from a kli rishon. Okay, an iroi of a kli rishon is right in this realm of what we call Tata'ah gavar. So even though the kli at the bottom is cold, what came out is hot, and therefore it asers kadei klipa, or it absorbs kadei klipa. Let's just say it's not necessarily aser. Right. So what's poured from a kli rishon, even though it's going into a kli sheni by definition, the kli sheni absorbs kadei klipa for exactly this reason, because Tata'ah gavar, it doesn't absorb it completely, as it would if it were a kli rishon, and then it would absorb completely. But if it's a kli sheni getting poured straight from a kli rishon, then it absorbs a kadei klipa. So now, that has ramifications. If, for example, you poured meat soup into a kli sheni, so that kli sheni direct now has a kedei klipa of meat inside it, just a kedei klipa, not the entire thing. Okay, that will also have ramifications if, for example, you put hot milk into this kli afterwards, right? Do you have to measure against the entire thickness of the kli, or do you just have to measure the thickness of the kedei klipa of the kli in order to see if the milk inside it became aser? Right? To do when you want to do a calculation of 60 against however much meat was absorbed. So you only have to look at the klipa if it's a kli sheni, which makes things.
You're talking about pouring a pot of soup into a kli sheni.
Yes.
But if you have a pot of soup and you're using a ladle.
Excellent.
The ladle's now a kli sheni, and now it's going into a kli.
Excellent. 100% correct. 100% correct. But I'll add again a little caveat. It depends how long the ladle has been in the pot. Because if the ladle was in the pot while the pot was boiling, then the ladle is also kli rishon.
But if you're just dipping it in, you put it on.
But if you took a cold ladle, dipped it into the soup, and took it out and put it into the bowl, that's a kli shlishi.
Right.
The ladle is the kli sheni, and the bowl is the kli shlishi. So now these are by the way, this has also got ramifications for Shabbos.
Yes,
you know, if you're dishing up your soup on Shabbos and you want to know, can you put your challah in, because some people hold that challah is kalei habishul, and it's easy to cook. So therefore you shouldn't put your bread into your soup if it's a kli sheni. So there you want to be careful that your ladle, if you're worried about doing that, then you want to make sure that your ladle doesn't stay sitting in the soup while it's a kli rishon. Because then the ladle itself will become a kli rishon, and the bowl will become a kli sheni.
Same with cholent.
Yes, same as cholent. Well, no, but hold on. Cholent is a davar gush. Okay, we're moving into Hilchos Shabbos, but it also has, you know, it's also got kashrus ramifications. But the davar gush, if you've got a big chunk of meat, you know, any chunk of meat that was in your cholent pot, and you put that on your plate, that is a kli rishon. That piece of meat itself is a kli rishon.
You put it into a kli shlishi then.
Even if it's sitting in a kli sheni, even if it's sitting in a kli shlishi, the meat itself is a kli rishon. Right, so you got to be careful with kalei habishul next to it, because it could cause something else to cook right next to it.
Why isn't the metal ladle? Why isn't the ladle taking out the cholent kli rishon?
Because of the din of a davar gush, a solid lump, right? The solid lump means think about it. You take that piece of cholent meat out of the pot, and you put it on your plate, and you cut it open. It is steaming hot inside, even though the outside has cooled off a little bit. Maybe as soon as you cut it open, you can see the steam coming up because it holds the heat inside. That's the rationale behind the davar gush. So that applies to the meat, to the potatoes. Those are right. They're solid, and they hold the heat. So on Shabbos you have to be careful because those things are considered a kli rishon.
What if the ladle that you just about Hilchos Shabbos, that the ladle is plastic, not metal? Does that matter? It also become a kli rishon?
I also thought about that. There's a good svara. You have those plastic ladles that you can put them into the soup, take them out, and touch the outside, and it doesn't feel even vaguely hot, because it's very sort of heat resistant. Svara says you're right. The Maaseh, I'm not sure. The Maaseh, I'm not sure that you could do that, because there's a certain amount of what's the I don't want to use the wrong word over here, but it's not all about physics. Some of it is, for example, you're allowed to put things in the sun. You're allowed to put things in the sun to cook. If you put I'm going to be careful about. You can't use something that was heated by the sun. So if you can't put like a metal tray in the sun and then fry an egg on it. But if you have a really hot day and you take, let's say, a plastic bowl, It's not going to be significantly heated by the sun. And you put an egg out in the sun in the plastic bowl, and it cooks in the sun. That's 100% mutar. It can be hot. It's hot. It's eggs are kalei bishul, easily cooked, and you have a beautiful edible egg after you've left it out in the sun for however long it is, depending on how hot the sharav is. That's a totally allowed way of cooking on Shabbos. Okay, so it's not just about the heat. It's also about what's being used to heat it and what's the kli that it's in. So I'm a little hesitant to say that the plastic ladle would then lose its din of a kli rishon. Let's say if you have that plastic ladle sitting in the soup the whole time, I would still call it a kli rishon. Okay. Any other questions?
No.
Okay. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rochelle.
Okay. Have a wonderful evening. See you
Good night,
next week. Good night.
everybody.
We're on tomorrow?
Mi'at Hashem.
Okay.